It was the longest ever US presidential speech to Congress, over an hour and 40 minutes, during which Donald Trump took credit for taking swift action on the economy, saying his tariffs would lead to a little disturbance but long-term gains. He praised his own action against diversity, declaring a war on wokeness, and repeated his bid to crack down on migration and take back the Panama Canal and take Greenland one way or another. On Ukraine, he mentioned a letter he received from Volodymyr Zelensky and said Russia was also ready for peace. Throughout the speech, there was repeated loud applause and standing ovations from Republicans. Democrats, meanwhile, held up placards reading lies, and one lawmaker was thrown out of the room. Here's a quick extract, firstly from Trump's speech.
We've ended the tyranny of so-called diversity, equity, and inclusion policies all across the entire federal government and indeed the private sector and our military. And our country will be woke no longer. And hundreds of billions of dollars to support Ukraine's defense, with no security, with no anything. Do you want to keep it going for another 5 years? Yeah, you would say Pocahontas says yes.
Well, to examine the weight behind those words, we're joined now by Professor of Political Science at Hamline University in Minnesota, David Schultz, and also by our correspondent in Washington, Fraser Jackson. Fraser, maybe I'll briefly start with you just to give us, firstly, the main takeaways from that lengthy address.
Well, seeing as we're a news channel, I think we have to say he didn't really make much news this time around. It was mainly a list of accomplishments rather than a looking forward of legislative achievements that he hopes to achieve. He did mention a couple of things about rare earth that he's going to increase, and shipbuilding as well, but ultimately not much news. A couple of foreign policy things that we can discuss later, but he spoke about the tariffs, the 25% tariffs that have come in, hitting Canada and Mexico as well. And Donald Trump has started in the last couple of days to say that there will be a little bit of disturbance. He repeated that this night, saying there'll be a little bit of disturbance, but we're okay with that. It won't be much. He mentioned especially the farmers in America who might feel the impacts of those tariffs. Of course, if you cast your mind back to his first time in office, there was a kind of bailout scheme because of the trade war that he started with China, with the amount of tariffs that he put on China as well. It ultimately ended up costing the US government about $60 billion in bailouts to farmers whose livelihoods have been impacted because of that trade war. But otherwise, there's not really much substantive in this for middle America. The cost of living is the number one thing that people are most worried about still. And of course, it was during the election as well. And there wasn't too much in that speech about that. He mentioned the price of eggs, which somehow within the course of this last election became the kind of yardstick for the cost of living and inflation here in the United States. He blamed Joe Biden for the cost of those eggs, but he didn't really go into what he's substantively going to do to tackle those prices. He kept mentioning tariffs, but of course, tariffs are an inflationary item as well. So it was a mostly culture war issue kind of a joint address to Congress. And of course, they're the kind of things that he's running for the last decade or so, talking about trans rights, the diversity, equity and inclusion programs and things that he was scrapping in the federal government, but otherwise nothing really there for the middle of America in this speech.
Okay, Fraser, stay with us, but let me bring in Professor of Political Science at Hamline University in Minnesota, David Schultz. David Schultz, I have to say I had pretty much the same takeaway as Fraser Jackson. Nothing majorly new in this lengthy address to Congress, but perhaps as an American you see things differently. What was the main takeaway as far as you saw it?
Well, the way I would describe it, it was a made-for-television event that appealed to his base, and in the process, there was a list of grievances that he still had, shifting blame for everything like the price of eggs back to Biden, and also at the same time trying to claim lots of credits for lots of things. So that's first. The second, I've never seen a speech like this in America where a sitting president goes so far out of his way to blame a previous president or previous presidents for problems. You don't see that. So that's my first two takeaways. The other thing is that, especially for a European audience, it was very, very thin in terms of his discussion about Ukraine or about the goals and objectives of American foreign policy. And with that, not very clear what he really wants to accomplish with all the tariffs and all the sanctions he wants to do. So I would agree with both of your assessments that it was short on detail, but it was clearly a message for his base. And the fact that he was taunting the Democrats indicated that what? He knew he was speaking to one side and not trying to reach across the aisles or reach across of America. It wasn't an effort to try to be what? A speech to unite America, but it played on the divisions that were already there.
I have to say that is one thing that stood out was the visible division in that House of Representatives. I mean, we saw a silent protest from many Democrats and even some of them walking out during that speech.
No, you're absolutely correct. I mean, we might recall that many years ago when I think it was Obama who was speaking at one point and someone yelled out about 20 minutes into a speech, "You're a liar," or something like that. And that was kind of a rarity back then, kind of like broke, almost like a shattered a ceiling, or whatever metaphor we're looking at. Now it seems to be pretty regular that we're getting one side heckling the other, and pretty regular at this point to where we're getting a president, at least with Donald Trump, I would say, where not even the pretense, not even sort of effort to try to reach across the aisles, but saying that essentially we have a divide. I'm speaking to my side, and sort of claiming, as he did early on, that he has this huge mandate, even though it was still actually an incredibly close election. So again, it speaks to all that, what I'm going to say, all the problems in American politics about polarization, winner take all politics. And to a large extent, I still have to come back and say, remember, Donald Trump's a showman. 17 years hosted or honed his skills on the show The Apprentice. Tonight was a showmanship in terms of him trying to appeal to a particular audience.
And indeed, we did see some of those reoccurring themes that appeal to that audience, notably the crackdown on migration in that area. Is that the area that Trump has maybe made the most actual moves on so far in his presidency?
Probably the most actual moves, but whether or not he's made the most actual gains is questionable, because if you start to look at the statistics and compare, let us say, the number of deportations under Trump compared to, let's say, Biden or going back to Obama, his numbers in many ways are not much different. The techniques are clearly different in terms of sending out ICE, sending out Homeland Security, and doing raids. But if we're looking at the actual numbers, no. And if he's claiming, as he did in the speech here, that the number of people trying to enter the United States is down, this is part of a curve that was already going back to many of the Biden policies that had been enacted last year, which were already decreasing the number of people arriving at the border. So he does what he does well in terms of claiming credit for what other people have done and shifting the blame for things that he does not want to take the responsibility for.
Well, indeed, over the, 1 hour and 40 minutes, we did see somewhat of a laundry list of what Trump saw as his achievements over the last 6 weeks. But he also mentioned things he has taken the United States out of. Let's take a very quick listen to that part of the speech.
I withdrew from the unfair Paris Climate Accord, which was costing us trillions of dollars that other countries were not paying. I withdrew from the corrupt World Health Organization. And I also withdrew from the anti-American UN Human Rights Council.
Listening to that, I mean, firstly, how do Americans feel about the United States withdrawing from such major international organizations? And, while we often get distracted by what Trump is saying when it comes to Ukraine and all that, what has he actually made actions on these other issues like the environment?
Okay, so first off, we're divided. If we overall look at American public opinion, they do not support these actions in terms of pulling out of the Paris Accords, the World Health Organization, and so forth like that. But if we kind of parse it a little bit more, again, his base supports a lot of these things. Democrats and independents do not. But what also becomes interesting is that clearly he's thinking this is making America great again. But if we have to keep in mind that the strength of the United States since post-World War II has really been the alliances and the alliances and the organizations that we've created through the United Nations, through international organizations that have really projected the American image. And so that becomes kind of the interesting contradiction here, is that the isolationism really is weakening America, and as opposed to strengthening it. Now, in terms of is him sort of living up to these promises and saying, okay, I pulled us out of the Paris Accords. It saved us trillions of dollars. Again, absolutely no evidence of that. And that may be one of the other things we want to be thinking about here, is that by the time the dust settles on this speech, there were a lot of inaccuracies. Like, for example, his claim that we have spent, hundreds of billions of US dollars helping Ukraine is just false in terms of numbers. His story at one point where he talked about how many people were receiving Social Security beyond age 100 or whatever like that, completely false. The stories have been falsified. So a lot of inaccuracies, but that seemed to be his motive. Remember, or his MO. Remember, when he was president the first time, I think it was the Washington Post at one point had cataloged nearly 10,000 falsehoods or lies. And he's repeating those same misstatements or lies, whatever you want to call it, in terms of going to his presidency right now, after 44 days.
And finally, Professor Schultz, you mentioned there that he did win the popular vote and the other vote in the United States by a very small margin. Today, how popular is Donald Trump?
He's basically at about 48, 49, 50%, depending on where the polls are. He basically is where he was on the day of the election, winning just about 50% of the vote, but not quite, didn't get a majority. And his public approval rating is at about 50%. So he hasn't really have a honeymoon period whatsoever in terms of bringing people over. And there's some indications, depending on what polls you look at this point, that some of the public opinion is starting to wobble as the tariffs are starting to impact, for example, farmers. There seems to be some indications that the policies are not being supported, and whether and how that's going to translate over into his own personal approval rating, we're going to see that over the next few weeks.
Professor Schultz of Hamline University, thanks so much indeed for your time and joining us here on France 24. Well, let us bring back in our correspondent now, Fraser Jackson. Fraser, just mentioning there one of the other main issues when it comes to Trump's speech, it is, of course, the economy, with Trump saying that he's turning things around, though admitting that the tariffs are going to cause at least short-term pain.
Yeah, and again, it's something that he's mentioned slightly more in the last couple of days. He's kind of acknowledged that there will be some short-term pain for some people in the American economy. But of course, Donald Trump has repeatedly said that these tariffs are going to be borne by the countries that export things to the United States. And that simply doesn't really play out. So economists agree that the end user is always is pretty much always the person that ends up bearing the cost of those tariffs, absorbing the cost of those tariffs in the long run. And really, there was an interesting point made by an analyst that I was listening to last night who said that the people that you have most leverage over in the world tend to be your allies, because you either have trade agreements with them, security agreements with them as well. And if you annoy those allies by slapping things like a 25% tariff on anything they export to you, that actually all it ends up doing is gnawing away at goodwill. And of course, Mexico and Canada in particular are the first and second, respectively, largest trading partners of the United States. And this has really angered a lot of people on both sides of the border, but especially the Canadians. The Canadians are furious about this. And my friends that live across the border tell me that there is a renewed sense of unity in Canada, that they like America, they love America, but this has really angered them. And they're seeing a widespread boycott of American products now in Canada, with supermarkets and elsewhere now trying to push people to buy Canadian products or simply not stocking American products whatsoever. We've also heard from the Premier of Ontario, Doug Ford, just a couple of hours ago, who said that over 1.5 million people get electricity in the United States from Ontario, and he said he was going to cut them off. So this is going to be a real-world impact to these people now in America because of these trade tariffs. And of course, the price of goods will also likely end up going up as well. So whether the impact is enough to kind of sway public opinion on Donald Trump and his approval ratings, of course, remains to be seen. But Donald Trump at the moment saying that it's because of these tariffs that more companies are coming home. Companies like Apple, who are announcing a significant increase of hundreds of billions of dollars in the United States, and also semiconductors as well, like Taiwan's biggest semiconductor company, also saying that they're going to invest more money in America as well. Donald Trump says it's because of the threats of those tariffs that these kind of companies are doing that as well.
Fraser, overall, looking back at this speech to Congress, it did seem quite light on the international relations front. Towards the end of it, we did hear him mention that letter he'd received from Ukraine's Volodymyr Zelensky, but no major reveal.
Nothing really massive that we were expecting. Of course, Donald Trump has been running on an America First platform for the best part of the last decade. Foreign policy was kind of crowbarred in at the end, despite it being one of his favourite topics to talk about when you talk to him in person. He discussed the Panama Canal. Of course, nothing new about what he said there. There was one line that did pique my interest, though, when he said good luck to Marco Rubio when he was dealing with the Panama Canal. He said to Marco Rubio, now we know who to blame if anything goes wrong. Which was said in a joking manner, but if you read some of the headlines and talk to some of the sources that I've spoken to about the relationship that Trump and Rubio have and the change that Rubio has undergone over the course of the last couple of years, that could be seen as a more telling line. There was also a line about Greenland. Of course, Donald Trump wants that to be part of the United States. Another eye-raising moment was when he said, one way or another, we're going to get it. And the Danish ambassador was in the audience at Congress there and didn't look too pleased about that line. But Ukraine was what we were looking at after that bust-up between Zelensky and J.D. Vance and the president inside the Oval Office on Friday. He discussed Ukraine. He said that they'd sent billions of dollars to Ukraine. The Democrats applauded that. Trump then lashed out at those Democrats, saying that they wanted the conflict to continue. But of course, once again, Donald Trump got the figures wrong about how much money the United States has sent to Ukraine. It's not 350 billion. It's actually closer to 180 billion, which has been appropriated, and even not all of that has been sent to Ukraine. But the news that we did get is that he'd received a letter from Zelensky. I'll read part of that now. The letter read, Ukraine is ready to come to the negotiating table as soon as possible to bring lasting peace closer. Nobody wants peace more than the Ukrainians. Zelensky continued, my team and I stand ready to work under President Trump's strong leadership to get a peace that lasts. We do really value how much America has done to help Ukraine maintain its sovereignty and independence regarding the agreement on minerals and security. Ukraine is ready to sign it at any time that is convenient for you. Now, Donald Trump said that he appreciated Zelensky sending that letter. So whether that is enough to put a finer point on the spat that has erupted in the Oval Office since Friday remains to be seen. But that minerals deal and how a ceasefire deal shapes up is still going to be discussed on Thursday by European countries. And after that discussion, that's when it'll go back to the US, I'm told, for the US to kind of rubber stamp it, as it were.
OK, Fraser Jackson in Washington, thanks very much indeed.